The 1940s were years dominated by war. The population was 132 million and rising because of the Europeans fleeing to the United States from Hitler and the Holocaust. This was a good thing, though, as they brought new ideas to the United States. War production is what pulled the United States out of the Depression. While the men were off to war, the women were needed to replace them in the workforce. After the war, the men returned home. Now blacks would no longer accept lesser status. The GI Bill allowed more men than ever to get a college-level education. Women had to give up their jobs for the men returning, but they had tasted independence. Throughout the decade, there were many events that changed the future of the United States. Some good, some bad. But in this video, we're going to go ahead and take a look at what had changed the United States. At the beginning of the decade, big bands dominated popular music. Artists such as Glenn Miller, Tommy Dorsey, Duke Ellington, and Benny Goodman led some of the most famous bands. Eventually, singers with the big band struck out on their own. Bing Crosby, whose song is playing in the background, used his smooth voice to become one of the most popular singers of that time. Toward the end of the era, bebop and rhythm and blues grew out. Radio was also huge at this time. It was called the lifeline for Americans during the 1940s. Radio provided news, music, and entertainment much like today's television. Some things that played on the radio were soap operas, quiz shows, children's hours, mystery stories, fine drama, and sports. Two of the most popular radio hosts of the decade was Kate Smith and Arthur Godfrey. Some radio shows were even continued onto the TV. Shows like Red Skeleton, Abbott and Costello, Jack Benny, Bob Hope, and Truth or Consequence all made the conversion. At the beginning of the decade, the first inexpensive book was released. Book clubs proliferated, and book sales went from 1 million all the way up to 12 million volumes a year. During the decade, many important literary works were written. Shirley Jackson wrote The Lottery, which was written to demonstrate how perfectly normal people could allow something like the Holocaust. William Soroyan wrote The Human Comedy, which tackles the question of prejudice against the setting of World War II. There was also many fads during this decade. In dancing, the jitterbug made its appearance at the beginning of the decade. It was the first dance in 2 centuries that allowed individual expression. GIs took the dance overseas when they went to war, dancing with the local girls, barmaids, or even each other if it was necessary. Rosie the Riveter became the symbol of the working women, as men went off to war and the women were needed to work in the factories. During the decade, there were many pin-up girls, which were too explicit to show. These, however, were a symbol for men at war. Pictures were mounted on the lockers and inside helmets to remind the men what they were fighting for. The picture "Kilroy was here" also became huge. Wherever American soldiers went, even the first to arrive would find a picture of eyes and a nose with the message "Kilroy was here." After returning, Kilroy began to mark his place on walls and rocks at public places. One pregnant woman even walked into the delivery room with the message "Kilroy was here" painted on her belly. With the invention of the refrigerator came the idea for frozen dinners. When the television finally came into existence, these dinners became known as TV dinners. Tupperware and aluminum foil made the mother's job even easier. Diners, which were originally horse-drawn carriages with a couple bar stools, became stationary, respectable staples of the post-war culture. During the war, teens became even more important in the United States. Teens found employment, and so they had money to spend. Because of this, advertisements were quickly aimed at teens. Fashion wasn't too big during the decade because of the restrictions made by the war production department. The zoot suit was the height of fashion among daring young men until the war production department restricted the amount of fabric that could be used in men's garments. The same restriction led to the popularity of the women's convertible suit, which was a jacket, short skirt, and a blouse. The jacket could be shed for more formal attire at night. When the war ended, so did its restrictions. Christian Dior introduced the new look. It was feminine dresses with long, full skirts and tight waists. Comfortable low-heeled shoes were forsaken for high heels. Hair was curled high on the head in front and worn to the shoulders in the back, and makeup was socially acceptable. The sweater was also made popular by Rita Hayworth. It took time to put the new look together, but it was time the women now had because of the men returning and reclaiming their jobs in the factories and offices. Throughout the decade, the theater wasn't exactly at its prime. Plays were bizarre and difficult to understand. On the bright side of things, however, the musical theater was reborn. During the 40s, movies became big. Movies were declared the essential industry for moral and propaganda. Most plots had a fairly narrow and predictable set of morals, and if Germans or Japanese were included, they were one-dimensional villains. However, what goes up must come down. With the invention of the television in 1948, the boom years of the movies began to fade. At the end of the war, the television was invented. However, at the end of the war, only 5,000 television sets with 5-inch black and white screens were in the American homes. By 1951, however, 17 million had been sold. Sports during the 40s were changed drastically because of World War II. Because of the war, all able-bodied men between 18 and 26 were expected to serve in the military. Rubber was also sent to the war efforts. Because of this, balls were soggy and unresponsive. Wood was also in short supply, leading to a shortage of baseball bats and bowling pins. Even with all of this, professional sports were encouraged to continue to help improve morale of the troops. President Roosevelt signed the Green Light Letter, which supported baseball. Baseball games were considered so important to the troop morale that the Japanese tried to jam radio broadcasts. By 1943, half the baseball players had enlisted. Teams used older veterans and even a one-armed outfielder, Pete Gray of the St. Louis Browns. After the war, television and easier transportation changed the face of American sports. In 1947, Jackie Robinson became the first black professional baseball player and even the first black professional athlete outside of boxing. Before 1941, when two-platoon football wasn't allowed, all 11 players on a team played the entire game. Only injury was an excuse for substitution. That changed in 1941 when free subs were allowed, enabling weakened college teams to continue playing. Because of travel restrictions, the 1942 Army-Navy game was played in Annapolis, and half the midshipmen were assigned to cheer for West Point. The penalty flag, which was first used in 1941, became official in 1948. Elaborate playbooks were introduced by Paul Brown, turning football into a game of strategy. Basketball was less affected by the war than the other sports because a player's height often made him ineligible for military service. The Basketball Association of Americans, which was formed in 1946, merged in 1949 with the National Basketball League to form the NBA. Joe Fulks of the Philadelphia Warriors had a record high score of 63 points in a game when most whole teams didn't even score that high. The 1940s was when boxing was in its prime. Boxing was big money mainly because of the gambling and was ruled by gangland boxing star Frankie Carbo. Joe Louis was the heavyweight champion from 1937 to 1948, in part because major boxing titles were frozen from 1941 to 1946 as 4,000 professional boxers joined the military. Louis not only enlisted, he donated over $100,000 to war relief efforts in 1942. Some other big-name boxers were Sugar Ray Robinson, Ike Williams, and Willie Pep. The Indianapolis 500 was closed during the war and the racetrack deteriorated. In the first post-war race in 1946, 24 cars dropped out due to wrecks and mechanical difficulties. NASCAR, a stock car racing club that purposely ran cars that you could buy from a dealer's showroom, started the Grand Nationals in 1949. The Women's Professional Golf Association formed in 1946, and the Ladies Professional Golf Association formed in 1949. Babe Didrikson, Zaharias, and Patty Berg were the stars, with Brian Nelson the men's champion. Jack Kramer also dominated in men's tennis during this decade. Moving back to 1940 was the election of 1940. This election was fought in the shadow of World War II as the United States was emerging from the Great Depression. Franklin D. Roosevelt, a Democrat, broke with the tradition and ran for a third term, which became a major issue. The surprise Republican candidate was Wendell Willkie, a dark horse who crusaded against Roosevelt's perceived failure to end the Depression and his supposed eagerness for war. Roosevelt promised no involvement in foreign war if he was reelected. Roosevelt won a comfortable victory by building strong support from labor unions, big city political machines, ethnic voters, and the traditionally democratic Solid South. Then came the Lend-Lease Act. The Lend-Lease Act was the program under which the United States of America supplied the United Kingdom, the Soviet Union, China, Free France, and other allied nations with materials between 1941 and 1945. It was signed into law on March 11, 1941, a year and a half after the outbreak of World War II. Then came December 7, 1941. On this day, the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor. The Japanese attack force was under the command of Admiral Nagomu. The Japanese attack force consisted of 6 carriers with 423 planes. Casualties included 2,335 servicemen and 68 civilians, including 1,178 people wounded. This brought the U.S. into World War II, and the day after Pearl Harbor, the U.S. and Britain declared war on Japan. In 1942 was the Coconut Grove Fire. The fire killed 492 people, which led to vast reforms in fire codes and safety standards. The Coconut Grove was Boston's premier nightclub during the post-Prohibition 1930s and 1940s. On November 28, 1942, this club was the scene of the deadliest nightclub fire in U.S. history, killing 492 people, which in itself was 32 more than the building's authorized capacity, and injuring hundreds more. It was also the second worst single building fire in American history. Only the 1903 Iroquois Theater fire in Chicago had a higher death toll of 602. In 1944 was the GI Bill. The Servicemen's Readjustment Act of 1944, known as the GI Bill, was a law that provided a range of benefits for returning World War II veterans. Benefits included low-cost mortgages, loans to start a business or farm, cash payments of tuition and living expenses to attend college, high school or vocational education, as well as 1 year of unemployment compensation. It was available to every veteran who had been on active duty during the war years for at least 90 days and had not been dishonorably discharged. Also in 1944 was another election. President Roosevelt had been in office longer than any other president, but remained popular. Unlike 1940, there was little doubt that Roosevelt would run for another term as a Democratic candidate. The Republican opponent was Governor of New York, Thomas E. Dewey. Dewey ran an energetic campaign, but as expected, Roosevelt prevailed. On June 6, 1944 was D-Day. D-Day is the name given to the landing of 160,000 Allied troops in Normandy, France. This operation was also called Operation Overlord, which included 5 separate landings by American, Britain, and Canadian forces, and was commanded by American Dwight D. Eisenhower. The Germans caused over 10,000 casualties, but could not repel the Allied forces. There were over 100,000 people to land on the beach by either ship or parachuting from a plane. The most difficult landing was at Omaha Beach because navigation troubles drowned many troops. Omaha Beach had the largest amount of German troops there, and the landing was illustrated in the beginning of the movie Saving Private Ryan. In 1945, atomic bombs were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Days later, Japan surrendered, ending World War II. With the first 2 to 4 months of the bombings, the acute effects killed 90,000 to 166,000 people in Hiroshima and 60,000 to 80,000 in Nagasaki, with roughly half the deaths in each city occurring on the first day. The Hiroshima Prefecture Health Department estimated that of the people who died on the day of the explosion, 60% died from flash or flame burns, 30% from falling debris, and 10% from other causes. During the following months, large numbers died from the effect of burns, radiation sickness, and other injuries. In both cities, most of the dead were civilians, although Hiroshima had a sizable garrison. In 1945, a year after his 4th election, Franklin D. Roosevelt dies. His health was declining and it was known. In April that year, President Roosevelt stated that he had a terrific pain in the back of his head, after saying that he slumped forward unconscious. Later that day, he was diagnosed with a massive cerebral hemorrhage, or a stroke. At 3:35 that day, Roosevelt died. Harry S. Truman became the President of the United States. On May 8, 1945, World War II allies formally accepted the unconditional surrender of the armed forces of Nazi Germany and the end of Adolf Hitler's Third Reich. The formal surrender of the occupying German forces in the Channel Islands was not until May 9, 1945. On April 30th, Hitler committed suicide during the Battle of Berlin, and so the surrender of Germany was authorized by his replacement, President of Germany, Karl Donitz. The Marshall Plan, officially the European Recovery Program, was a large-scale American program to aid Europe where the United States gave monetary support to help rebuild European economies after the end of World War II in order to prevent the spread of Soviet communism. The plan was in operation for 4 years, beginning in April 1948. The goals of the United States were to rebuild a war-devastated region, remove trade barriers, modernize industry, and make Europe prosperous again. Next came the Berlin blockade. The blockade was one of the first major international crises of the Cold War. During the multinational occupation of post-World War II Germany, the Soviet Union blocked the Western Allies' railway, road, and canal access to the sectors of Berlin under Allied control. Their aim was to force the Western powers to allow the Soviet zone to start supplying Berlin with food and fuel, thereby giving the Soviets practical control over the entire city. In 1948 was the next presidential election. The United States presidential election of 1948 was the greatest election upset in American history. Virtually every prediction, with or without public opinion polls, indicated that incumbent President Harry S. Truman would be defeated by Republican Thomas E. Dewey. Both parties had severe ideological splits, with the far left and the far right of the Democratic Party running third-party campaigns. Truman's surprise victory was the 5th consecutive presidential win for the Democratic Party. With simultaneous success in the 1948 congressional elections, the Democrats regained control of both houses of Congress, which they had lost in 1946. All of the events that we have reviewed in this video have helped shape America in some way, and have also helped to make America what it is today.